We are continuing on in your genetics chapter. I'm on page 684 where we left off, and we're going to pick up with genetic mutations. So we talked about the genes, we talked about being recessive and dominant, and how you actually view what you are based on what you got from your parents. Well, a mutation is when things don't necessarily work out correctly in the creation of that baby. And what can happen is that once baby has started being created, they got their genes from their parents, and they are in the process of growing in their mom's belly, they can be exposed to something like radiation, chemicals, alcohol, drugs, viruses, chemicals of any kind that can then alter that growing baby. So when they got the genes from their parents, they were fine. Then when they were exposed, it changed them. And you can see this with like fetal alcohol babies, where it was the alcohol consumption of the mother that altered the growing baby in a negative way. All right. Trisomy. Let's talk about trisomy. Tri means 3, right? So you're supposed to get one pair, one of each of these 23 pairs from each parent, right? Well, what happens if the body goes to pick one of the pair and it sticks together? And what happens is that you actually get 2 from one of the parents, which means you end up with 3 in that line. When they pair them up, you end up with 3 in one of the categories, and you're only supposed to have 2. So this confuses the body. It does not know what to do with this extra thing, and it's going to show up in some way. Now, sometimes this could be such a birth defect that the baby can't survive. Sometimes those are miscarriages, that the body says, no, this is not possible, and it rejects. Other times it's a more minor problem, and the baby continues to develop and is born with some kind of an issue. And we'll talk in a minute about some of the trisomy diseases. We also can have monosomy, mono, 1. We go to pull up one of those pairs, and we miss, and nothing gets pulled. And so the baby only ends up with 1 when we start pairing them up. They end up with 1 instead of 2. And again, the body doesn't know what to do with it. Sometimes if it's inconducive to life, your body may miscarry it. Or if it's the lesser of the serious ones, you'll continue to grow and be born. This is an interesting chart here. It talks about different diseases and whether or not they are dominant or recessive. And I find this very interesting when we look at osteogenesis imperfecta is brittle bone disease. And it's dominant. And so you look at that and you think, but I don't know anybody who has this disease. You got to remember, just because it's dominant does not mean a lot of people carry it. It could be rare, but where it shows up, you're going to see it, okay, because it's dominant. Other things here are recessive, but they still show up, like cystic fibrosis is recessive, color blindness is recessive, hemophilia, it's a very common disease, but it's recessive. You can see that it mentions several of these listed on here as being X-linked. That's that one that the boys are going to have more often than the girls. Those are kind of interesting to look at. So let's talk about some of these diseases, and then we'll get into the trisomy and the monosomies. So cystic fibrosis is caused by a recessive gene in chromosome number 7. And what happens here is that it affects the lungs. It affects a very thick mucus in the lungs. And so it makes it really difficult to breathe. Phenylketonuria. This is something that we often will test newborn babies for in the hospital. And what happens is that your body is not producing this enzyme if you have this. This one is recessive. And so this enzyme is needed to convert amino acids in your body. And so if your body can't do this, it does lead to retardation and death, depending on how serious it is. It's an extreme case. And so these are things that we test babies for. Tay-Sachs. Tay-Sachs is a genetic disease that is commonly found in the Jewish populations. It causes severe retardation, and typically you don't live past age 4. There is nothing, there's no cure. All we can do is treat the symptoms and keep the patient as comfortable as possible. One of the reasons that it is very popular in your Jewish population dates back to the concentration camps. They found that being a Tay-Sachs carrier made you able to withstand tuberculosis. And so as tuberculosis was rampant in the concentration camps and killed a lot of people, the people who survived carried the Tay-Sachs gene. So you had it very prevalent in the survivors. With the Jewish population, they, for the next probably 40, 50 years, stayed very within their culture for marrying. And so when they would marry another Jewish person whose ancestors were survivors of the concentration camps, the chances of these two people having a Tay-Sachs baby were really high. And so there was a lot of genetic counseling going on with the Jewish population. There probably still is. Now, we have a lot more variety in the gene pool now because a lot of people have converted to Judaism, which means that if I do that, like my genetics are not survivors of the concentration camp, therefore I'm not carrying that Tay-Sachs gene, most likely. Alrighty. Okay, so now we're getting into the trisomies. The most common one is called trisomy 21, which means that this one right here, number 21, I've got 3. We call that Down syndrome. So you may know people with this disease. We've certainly all heard of it. And so you can see how common this happens. One of the things I think of with Down syndrome is that one of the things that makes somebody at risk of having a Down syndrome baby is having an older mother. Typically, if someone becomes pregnant over the age of 35, that your chances of having a Down syndrome baby increases greatly. So remember I said that when they go to pick one of the pair, they stick together and you get 2 of them from one of the parents. It's typically the mother. And I just think like your eggs are just old. And this is just one of the side effects of those older eggs, that they stick together when they go to pull those genetic choices. The next one that's also a trisomy is called Klinefelter. This one is a sex characteristics though. Typically, this is an XXY. They're supposed to get an X from their mom and a Y from their dad, right? If they're a boy. Well, this child gets an XXY. So when this child is developing their sex characteristics. Are they supposed to be a girl or a boy? We got this little battle going on in their sex chromosomes. So with this kind of child, they tend to have long legs, enlarged breasts, learning difficulties, small testicles, typically are sterile, and have some lung issues. So their body outwardly, you can see this picture here, has a penis. I mean, physically you would look at that and say it's a boy, but these other things are going on inside. So the next one is a monosomy. One of the monosomies is an XO syndrome. So instead of getting 3 sex chromosomes, they only got 1. They got an X and a nothing. So again, how does this body develop? It doesn't have what it needs to completely turn into a little girl, but it's not a boy either. So what happens with Turner syndrome is typically they do have female organs. They typically will not mature, which means they're infertile. Heart issues, they tend to be short, learning disorders, etc. Okay, genetic counseling. So if you know that you carry something or you fear that you carry something, you can have some genetic testing done. You can find out if you're carriers for various things. You can calculate your odds of having certain babies. So let's say I'm Jewish, maybe Tay-Sachs is somewhere in my family tree, and I am afraid I'm carrying it, and I don't want to have a baby like that. If I know that I'm going to have that baby, I just won't have babies. Okay? So I can go have genetic counseling with my potential husband or current husband and find out, are we at risk for having a baby with this? The pedigree chart is interesting, but they only can go by your family tree on what we know people have. And of course, it's only diseases that are showing up. Now, if something shows up, like they're showing here, this baby has something, whatever this trait is, it's somewhere in your tree, which means genetically someone is carrying it and passing it on. So I might have it. Okay, because I could be that person. When it's recessive, you don't know. Punnett squares are awesome. I'm going to do a whole video on just Punnett squares. I'm going to skip it for now and do just a Punnett square video. Karyotypes are really interesting because we're actually testing the growing infant. So we actually go into the fetus and we get some of the fluid that it's growing in and we test it. So the procedure is called an amniocentesis. We stick a needle in. We have an ultrasound going on here so that we can see where the needle is going, so that we know the needle's not hitting a baby. We're going to hit an empty pocket and we want the fluid. This is a common procedure with older parents because of the chances of higher birth defects with an older mother. So a lot of times they will recommend that an older mother will have this test done. Younger mothers, typically this is not something that is normally done. There is certainly a danger with sticking a needle into the fetus's area, so we don't do it on young mothers. So I never had any of these. I was 30 when my youngest child was born, so I never had these. But if I were to have gotten pregnant at 40, they certainly would have been recommending it. What can we do about it? Well, there's a lot of gene therapy going on. It's a hot field of research of what is possible. Some of us get into some ethical issues of, should we be doing some of this? It's an interesting future of where that's going. How we learned about a lot of this with genetics is a doctor called Gregor Mendel. Is he a doctor? I think he was a monk. I don't think he was a doctor. Doesn't say. Pretty sure he was a monk. And he actually did a lot of experiments with pea plants, peas, you know, the vegetable. And he had like yellow and green plants, and he tried to like cross-pollinate them. And he is the one who realized that just because one genetic thing crossed over doesn't mean they all cross over. So that whole law of independent assignment came from him. He also learned that, like, when you crossed it, that it then could pass it on to the next child. So he would take like cuttings from the plant and grow a new plant, and he would be able to, so that was like the child. And he learned so much about our early years of genetics in his pea plant experiments. Pretty interesting. And that's the chapter. I'm going to do one more video on Punnett squares, okay? Because I believe you'll have some activities to do with Punnett squares, so it's really important that you understand how this works. So come back for the last video for this chapter on Punnett squares.